All right, well, let's go to the Swallows of Capistrano. I want to shift on you. Thank goodness for them. They keep coming back every year, and they keep us together. Give us a feel for that. It's 25% of the student body.
I mean, you got to say the metaphor there is not a happy one, because the Swallows stopped going back to Capistrano.
Oh, they did.
Yeah.
I've forgotten that.
So the metaphor there is not, that you can actually,
okay. Gotcha.
They knocked down all the nests to do painting.
Yeah.
The swallows came, the nests were all gone, and the swallows stopped coming. Right? And my argument is, there's a way in which that's what happened. These kids, these JP2 kids, some of whom are now 40 years old, not kids anymore, were an interesting phenomenon. They were highly intellectualized. Their faith was often what drew them to the faith or back to the faith, very often was a kind of intellectual conviction, which we'd seen before. Avery Dulles was an intellectual convert. John Henry Newman was an intellectual convert. Thomas Merton. That the mind is convinced of the structure of truth before the instrument of faith is engaged. And we've seen converts like that before. And that had a lot to do with this. Also, what that second half of the book is about is what Richard John Neuhaus would have called the Catholic moment, which was this brief period where it looked like we could see the mainline Protestant churches collapsing. They went from 50% of America down to 10%. Huge sociological change. And they ripped that pillar out of the support for America. I say, it's using a metaphor out of Michael Novak, that America is basically, this before, for several hundred years, was this three-legged stool in which you had capitalism, you had democratic politics, and you had Protestant religion. And they each pushed against the other and corrected the faults of the other. And so Protestant religion has this tendency to become totalizing, and capitalism or populism in democracy pushes back on that. Populism in democracy has this tendency to be vulgar and wants to grit, and religion pushes back on that. And the same with capitalism, right? The three of them pushed against each other and kept the stool stable.
True, it's just absolutely true.
You rip out one, which is the collapse of the mainline churches, right? And suddenly all we have is politics and capitalism. That is, to some degree, the definition of today. All we got is money and outrage. Those are the only two things we have left. And it's inherently unstable. There was a moment in the 80s, late 80s, the decade of the 90s, into the 2000s, where a deliberate effort was made, because it looked possible, to slot in Catholicism to replace the missing pillar, to give us a moral vocabulary, to give us the third leg that would push against the other legs and get pushed back against, right? That's the beauty of that metaphor of the three-legged stool. There was a brief period where it looked possible. And this is where I would go to all those meetings of...
What decade would that be?
90s.
Yeah.
I'd go to all those meetings of the evangelicals and Catholics together, and serious Protestants would come to that, serious Catholics. There was this vocabulary that actually triumphed. Its peak may have been George W. Bush's second inaugural address, which is not theological, it's highly philosophical. It is the language of Catholic natural law, right? Which is a philosophical concept, not a religious one. That may have been the peak of its influence, where the evangelical Mike Gerson, who wrote that speech, used this language. But I give lots of other examples. Just war theory. As late as the Korean War, just war theory was thought to be something eccentric that Catholics had to do to justify their participation in modern wars. Now, after that, in the run-up to the Iraq War, the New York Times is using just war theory to critique the run-up for the Iraq War. That Catholic vocabulary triumphed in a whole lot of ways. But the attempt of all of my friends and the people I was around to substitute Catholicism for the missing leg that the collapsed mainline Protestant churches were, failed. It failed. That project did not succeed.
I can see that. This is just Doug's opinion a little bit on this. I saw John Paul II and Benedict based on what I know and have read. What I would say, and I'm trying to be objective, there's no such thing, right? No one's objective in their own worldview, but I personally believe there is a Christian orthodoxy out there, somewhere, and I feel like they somehow, since the Leo and so on, the Catholic Church was, you can call it an Americanized version of Orthodoxy, I don't know, but it was moving in that direction. I believe that's still there for us to do together. I really do, and maintaining all of the foundations of the institutions. I hope it is, and that's what I pray for.